I'm joined by Richard Chasdi, who teaches at Walsh College in the U.S. state of Michigan. He's the author of Counter-Terror Offenses for the Ghost War World. Always great to have him on the broadcast. We're seeing an awful lot of bloodshed. We've seen it in Turkey, Malaysia, Bangladesh, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Indonesia, Thailand, the list goes on. Talk to me about this violence during Ramadan. You study this sort of thing. Is this unprecedented?
Well, first of all, I think some of my research has indicated that holidays and other religious and commemorative events do have a resonance for terrorists. And in parts of the Middle East, for example, you can't really separate religious institutions from the state. And so that oftentimes religious events have a political resonance, and that means that these sorts of attacks are not surprising. Having said that, I think several of these attacks may have different contexts, and so I hesitate to definitively link them to the same set of drivers or determinants. But what we're seeing here, I think, and I would agree with the common assessment on the part of many U.S. officials, is that with respect to the loss of territory that ISIS is experiencing, one New York Times reporter provided figures that 20% of territory in Syria and some 40% of territory in Iraq has been lost, and that this may signal a structural change in terms of emphasis on attacks that are spectacular attacks, to be sure, but are less expensive than funding conventional forces that, or funding attacks against conventional forces, I should say, to hold some of the territory of the caliphate.
So more loss of territory will result in more loss of life in terrorist attacks then? Is that the translation?
Well, more loss in territory imperils the notion of a caliphate that al-Baghdadi has talked about as leader of ISIL or ISIS. And for many, this is what distinguishes ISIS from many of its predecessors, and al-Qaeda, which many scholars believe is in a global competition with ISIS for finances and recruitment. We know that ISIS gets gets many of its resources from oil. At the beginning of our war against ISIS, one figure that was bandied about was that they make some $300 million per year. That's been cut to about $150 million. And in this same report, there was a discussion, though, with this loss of territory comes the loss of ability to pay fighters, to pay activists. And some reports have it that activists have had salaries or some form of remuneration cut by up to 50%.
Richard, let me ask you a question with regards to Ramadan. There were deadly attacks last year, which I wanted to point out: Kuwait, Tunisia, France. And at the time, an Islamic State spokesman called on followers to execute more attacks during Ramadan, saying, quote, "aspire to battle in this noble month." Tactically, what's the advantage of attacking during this holy month, and especially a holy site like the one we saw in Saudi Arabia?
Well, in a sense, this reminds me tactically of the 1973 Yom Kippur War. People are fasting. People are, in a sense, not on a war front posture. That from a tactical point of view, Ramadan is a time of intensive reflection on the part of the religious. This is a holiday that reflects the God-giving Muhammad, the Prophet Muhammad, the teachings of the Quran. So for those that are devout believers, this is a time of intensive reflection and an intensive set of peaceful activities where the emphasis is on doing good. So that this, from a tactical point of view, is probably prudent in terms of attacking those targets when people are really in another mode of thought.
Professor Richard Chasdi joining us from Michigan. Thanks so much.